A man stands beside a giant footprint imprinted on a rock. The footprint is over 1.2 meters long. If the footprint truly belonged to a living creature, the man would only reach about its ankles. Surprisingly, this isn't an isolated case. Similar, unusually large footprints have been recorded in many parts of the world, from Africa and Asia to Europe and the Americas. Some are found on rocks, millions of years old. Others have become part of the legends of ancient civilizations. For centuries, people have told stories of giant races once walking the earth. Are they all just myths? Or are these footprints preserving the memory of something real from the past? One of the world's most famous giant footprints is located in the Mpuluzi area of South Africa. Here, on the surface of a large rock, one can see an indentation that closely resembles a human footprint. This mark is approximately 1.2 meters long and deeply embedded in the rock. When an adult stands next to it, the size difference immediately becomes apparent. If body proportions were maintained as in modern humans, the owner of this footprint would likely be many times taller than an average person. What makes this site famous isn't just the size of the footprints. What makes it a real mystery is the type of rock that contains them. The rock at Mpuluzi is granite. This is one of the hardest and most durable types of rock on Earth. According to modern geology, granite is formed from molten magma deep underground. During crystallization, the temperature of the material can reach around 800 degrees Celsius or even higher. The rock then gradually cools and hardens over a very long period before being brought near the surface by geological processes. Therefore, a question immediately arises. If these marks are indeed footprints, when were they created? No creature could possibly step onto a mass of magma at hundreds of degrees Celsius and leave footprints. But if the rock had cooled completely and become as hard as modern granite, creating a deep, footprint-like indentation would also be extremely difficult. Both possibilities seem to lead to their own set of problems. That's why scientists don't consider this to be a true fossil footprint. The most common explanation is that the shapes at Mpuluzi are the result of natural weathering. Over millions of years, wind, water, temperature, and other environmental factors have continuously acted upon the rock surface. These actions can create countless different shapes. From this perspective, the Mpuluzi footprints are not true footprints, but merely a random geological formation. In addition, researchers also mentioned a psychological phenomenon called pareidolia. This is a natural tendency of the human brain to recognize familiar shapes in random objects. Humans may see faces in clouds, animal shapes on cliffs, or other familiar shapes, even though they don't actually exist. According to this reasoning, our brains are looking at a natural rock structure and interpreting it as the image of a foot. For many people, that explanation is sufficient. However, skeptics argue that this explanation doesn't fully resolve the issue. Pareidolia typically occurs when a shape only vaguely resembles a real object. A cloud might vaguely resemble a face. A cliff might vaguely resemble an animal. But the case at Mpuluzi seems more specific than that. Many have pointed out that this mark is not simply an unusual rock cavity. Its shape is thought to encompass the heel, the arch of the foot, and the area corresponding to the toes. The overall proportions of the structure are also quite close to the anatomical proportions of a human foot. If this is merely the result of natural weathering, the degree of coincidence seems far greater than in typical pareidolia examples. Another question that is often asked is, if random weathering could create a shape resembling a foot to this extent, what is the probability of such a phenomenon occurring? To date, the debate has largely revolved around whether the shape resembles a human foot sufficiently to be considered unusual. But almost no studies have provided a specific probability for such a coincidence. In other words, many people claim it's random, but very few have attempted to measure the degree of randomness. Therefore, the Mpuluzi footprints continue to lie on the boundary between geology and mystery. To some, it's simply a block of rock eroded in a peculiar way. To others, it's one of the strangest footprints ever discovered. And to this day, the debate is far from over. While the Mpuluzi footprints are primarily controversial because of their shape, the next site is controversial because of what is believed to have happened there. In the Paluxy River area of Texas, USA, some footprints discovered in the rocks have sparked a decades-long debate about the history of life on Earth. These traces are found within layers of limestone formed approximately 100 million years ago. According to the conventional understanding of geology and paleontology, this was a time when dinosaurs still dominated the planet. Modern humans had not yet appeared. Even the most distant ancestors of humankind are tens of millions of years away from that time. That's why what was reported at Paluxy quickly attracted attention. Some observers suggest that, in addition to dinosaur footprints, they have also found tracks resembling human footprints. Some tracks appear to have been made by bipedal creatures. A few instances have even been described as chains of footprints, extending over many consecutive steps. If this interpretation is correct, it would mean that a creature with a gait similar to humans once walked on the same surface as dinosaurs. That is why Paluxy quickly became one of the most controversial sites in the history of modern archaeology and paleontology. In the years that followed, many researchers surveyed the area. Some of the footprints that had been widely publicized were later identified as fakes created to be sold to tourists. The discovery of these fake footprints led many to believe that the entire story of Paluxy had been solved. However, the issue is not that simple. Those who continue to study the site point out that the fact that some footprints are fake does not mean that all the remaining tracks are fake. Many tracks still exist directly within the bedrock and cannot be dismissed simply by pointing to instances of forgery appearing elsewhere. Scientists have offered a different explanation. According to the most common explanation, the human-like footprints are actually dinosaur footprints that have been distorted by the process of fossil preservation. Some bipedal dinosaurs may have left quite different footprints, depending on their speed of movement, the softness of the ground, or the angle of their foot placement. In some cases, the entire foot of the dinosaur may have made contact with the muddy surface, creating a longer and more tapered shape than usual. After millions of years of erosion and geological changes, these footprints may have become more like human footprints than their original shape. This is currently the most widely accepted explanation. However, opponents continue to question certain specific sets of footprints. They argue that if all the footprints belonged to dinosaurs, then the same individual would have had to constantly switch between two very different types of foot placement over the same distance. In some sections, the footprints exhibit familiar dinosaur characteristics. In other sections, the footprints become narrower and more human-like in shape. Skeptics of the mainstream explanation argue that the change has not been fully described by a clear biological mechanism. They question whether an animal moving normally could actually leave two such distinct types of tracks along the same route. The debate is further fueled by another fact. Many of Paluxy's famous images continue to be widely shared today. For some, this is evidence that history can be more complex than we think. For most scientists, it's an example of how fossils can be misinterpreted when observed outside of their full geological context. Regardless of which side of the debate he takes, Paluxy remains one of the most famous cases involving supposedly human-like footprints in ancient rock formations. It demonstrates that even a few marks on rock can spark questions that have lasted for generations. But at least in Paluxy's case, the debate revolved around whose footprints actually belonged. The next case was different, because those footprints were confirmed by scientists to be real, studied for decades, and considered one of the most important fossils ever discovered about human history. While previous cases have been debated regarding the true nature of the footprints, the Laetoli site in Tanzania is entirely different. These are not a footprint whose authenticity is questionable. They are one of the most famous discoveries in paleoanthropology and have been studied by scientists worldwide for decades. In 1978, a research team led by Mary Leakey discovered a series of fossilized footprints preserved in ancient volcanic ash at Laetoli. Independent dating methods yielded relatively consistent results. These footprints are estimated to be approximately 3.6 million years old. What makes this discovery special is not just its age. What surprised the researchers was the shape of the footprints. Upon closer analysis, scientists discovered many features very similar to the feet of modern humans. The footprints clearly show the arch of the foot. The big toe is aligned with the other toes instead of being separated to one side, as in many other primates. Pressure marks also indicate that the owner moved by the heel touching the ground first and then shifting weight to the front of the foot, a gait very familiar to humans today. In other words, if you only looked at the footprints without knowing their age, many people might think these were the footprints of modern humans. However, the person believed to have created these footprints was not a modern human. Scientists believe the remains at Laetoli most likely belong to Australopithecus afarensis, an extinct hominid species. This is the same group of organisms to which the famous Lucy skeleton is classified. According to current research, Australopithecus afarensis may have walked on two legs but possessed a brain only about one-third the size of a modern human brain. There is also no clear evidence of this species making complex tools. To explain this paradox, modern science offers a relatively clear hypothesis. According to the widely accepted evolutionary model, the ability to walk on two legs appeared before the brain developed significantly. In other words, human ancestors learned to walk upright very early on, while traits such as high intelligence, language, and technology only appeared many millions of years later. This is the explanation commonly taught in scientific literature. However, some researchers and skeptics still raise noteworthy questions. If the foot is an incredibly complex biological structure with dozens of joints, ligaments, and sophisticated force distribution mechanisms, why did a form nearly identical to modern humans appear 3.6 million years ago? And if that form was efficient at the time, why does it seem to have changed so little while many other characteristics of our human ancestors continued to evolve over the following millions of years? For those asking this question, the intriguing aspect isn't that the ancient creatures walked on two legs. The intriguing aspect is the level of perfection in that gait. The debate becomes even more interesting as new research continues to be published. In 2019, scientists published further evidence suggesting that more than one group of bipedal creatures may have existed in Laetoli during the same period. This means that more than one different species of early humans may have left footprints in the same area. For scientists, this discovery helps to better understand the diversity of evolutionary paths in the past. But for skeptics, this finding opens up another question. If many different species walked bipedally at the same time, what spurred them all to a similar mode of locomotion? However it is interpreted, Laetoli remains one of the most important discoveries ever made about human history. It not only records the oldest known ancient footprints but also raises questions about when and how familiar human characteristics emerged during evolution. But footprints in nature are only part of the story. Even stranger is that in many parts of the world, ancient humans actively created giant footprints in rocks and preserved them for generations. Up to this point, all the footprints we've discussed have been believed to have appeared naturally. Some were formed in ancient rock. Some have become the subject of debate among researchers. But the next case is completely different. This time, the footprints weren't created by nature. They were intentionally carved into the rock by humans. It is noteworthy that this phenomenon does not occur in just one place. Around the world, archaeologists have documented thousands of footprints carved into rocks, often referred to as petrossomatoglyphs. This term refers to rock carvings depicting parts of the human body, particularly feet. Such footprints have been found in Syria, Sri Lanka, Scotland, and many other areas across multiple continents. What caught the researchers' attention wasn't just their number. According to numerous archaeological statistics, the number of such footprints runs into the thousands. Some studies estimate that the total number may exceed 3,000 recorded footprints worldwide. They appear in different cultures, at different times, and in various religious contexts. In Sri Lanka, one of the most famous footprints is located on a mountaintop known as Adam's Peak. Here, a giant footprint is interpreted in different ways by various religious communities. Some Buddhists believe it to be the footprint of Buddha. Some Hindus associate it with the god Shiva. Meanwhile, other traditions link the footprint to Adam or St. Thomas. In Syria and many other ancient Middle Eastern regions, footprints carved into stone were often associated with sacred figures or revered ancestors. In Scotland, archaeologists have also discovered deliberately carved footprints, often appearing in rituals related to power and the coronation of chieftains. On the surface, these examples seem unrelated. But when observing the entire picture, a strange pattern began to emerge. These cultures have no clear, direct connection to each other. They are separated by thousands of kilometers geographically. They exist in different historical periods. They use completely different languages, beliefs, and symbolic systems. However, many of them chose the same image to represent gods, great ancestors, or supernatural entities. Those are giant footprints. Scientists offer a relatively simple explanation for this phenomenon. According to popular belief, people everywhere tend to leave their mark. Handprints, footprints, or body images become easily understood symbols with powerful meanings. Therefore, it's not unusual for many different cultures to use footprints in rituals or religious symbols. This explanation certainly has a reason behind it. However, some independent researchers argue that it still hasn't answered the most important question. If the need to leave a mark is a universal human instinct, why do so many cultures choose giant footprints instead of countless other symbols? Why not a giant hand? Why not a face? Why not a complete body shape? It is noteworthy that in many cases, footprints do not simply represent an ordinary human being. Footprints are often associated with gods, enlightened beings, legendary heroes, or ancestors of stature far beyond that of ordinary people. For those pursuing alternative theories, the repetition of this pattern is hard to ignore. They pose a simple question. If dozens of independent cultures all choose the same symbol to represent the greatest entities in their collective memory, is it merely a coincidence? Or are they preserving a very ancient memory that has been passed down in various forms? No one has a definitive answer. But the existence of thousands of footprints carved into the rock reveals one thing clearly. Throughout history, humans seem to have always given the image of footprints a special meaning. And in many cases, those footprints are much larger than the size of an average human. So the question remains valid. Why does this image appear repeatedly in so many different cultures around the world? And why is it often associated with entities considered to be beyond human comprehension? After controversial footprints, rock-carved footprints, and ancient fossils dating back millions of years, the final footprint on this list is a case that has been widely accepted by science. There is no major debate about its existence. There is no major debate about its age. What is noteworthy is what this footprint might say about the evolutionary history of humankind. The site in question is located in South Africa and is commonly known as Eve's footprint. It is a fossilized human footprint preserved in coastal sandstone. Studies suggest that the footprint dates back approximately 117,000 years, making it one of the most famous ancient human footprints ever discovered. When researchers analyzed the shape of the footprints, they noticed something remarkable. These footprints are distinctly characteristic of a modern human being. The size of the foot, the position of the toes, the heel, and the overall structure are consistent with the anatomy of Homo sapiens. There is no indication that this is a transitional form between two different morphologies. There is no indication that this is a more primitive structure. If a modern person were to walk on today's moist sand, the footprints produced would be very similar in shape to Eve's footprint. That in itself is not unusual. But when Eva's footprints are placed alongside the discovery at Laetoli, an interesting question begins to emerge. The footprints at Laetoli are approximately 3.6 million years old. Meanwhile, Eve's footprints are only about 117,000 years old. The gap between these two discoveries spans more than 3 million years. That's an almost unimaginable period in human history. So, what happened to the foot during that time? For many, the answer seems simple. The foot continued to evolve gradually until it reached its modern form. However, when comparing key features between the Laetoli footprint and modern human footprints, many researchers have found significant similarities. Both show well-developed arches. Both exhibit the big toe aligned with the other toes. Both reflect a movement pattern where the heel touches the ground first. Then, the weight is shifted forward of the foot. In other words, many important features of the foot appear to have emerged very early on. Modern science has an explanation for this phenomenon. According to the prevailing evolutionary view, some biological traits reach their optimal state relatively early and then change very little over long periods. The human foot is considered one such example. Once the foot structure has effectively adapted to bipedal locomotion, the selective pressure to make further changes can be significantly reduced. As a result, the basic form is maintained for millions of years. This is the explanation accepted by many researchers. However, some argue that this explanation still leaves room for further consideration. If the foot achieved a nearly optimal design around 3.6 million years ago, why did so many other characteristics of our human ancestors continue to change dramatically around the same time? The brain increased significantly in size. Social behavior became more complex. Language emerged. Tools evolved from simple stone fragments into increasingly sophisticated engineering systems. While many other factors change, the feet seem to remain almost stationary. For skeptics, this is what makes the story interesting. They question whether a complex biological structure could truly reach a near-perfect state so early and then remain almost intact for millions of years. They also question whether the vastly different rates of change among bodily characteristics reflect the complete picture of evolution, or whether there are still aspects that are not fully understood. Of course, asking questions doesn't mean rejecting what science has already discovered. But the history of science always progresses thanks to such questions. Each new discovery often not only provides answers but also unlocks new mysteries. And perhaps that's the most fascinating thing about Eve's footprint. It's not a giant footprint. It's not next to a dinosaur footprint. It's not a mystical carving in stone. But when placed within the millions of years of human history, it forces us to think about the speed, sequence, and nature of the changes that have shaped us into who we are today. 5 footprints, 5 locations, 5 completely different stories. Each footprint receives its own interpretation. When a footprint appears in granite, it's natural weathering. When a footprint resembles a human footprint next to a dinosaur's, it's a deformed dinosaur footprint. When a nearly modern-looking footprint appears from millions of years ago, it's a special stage in evolution. When thousands of cultures use giant footprints as symbols of divinity, it's a universal psychological tendency. It's possible that all of those explanations are correct, but there's also a question worth considering. If each case requires a different explanation, why is the overall pattern so similar? Throughout the history of science, major breakthroughs have often occurred when people stopped defending a familiar assumption and began to consider the possibility that it might be incomplete. Many things once considered impossible have become common knowledge after sufficient evidence was gathered. The problem isn't that science is wrong. The problem is that people sometimes become too attached to what they already believe to be true. When evidence doesn't fit an existing model, there are 2 ways to respond. The first is to question the evidence. The second is to question the model itself. The best science always does both. The footprints on this list don't prove that giants ever existed, but they raise a more intriguing question. Are we seeing 5 separate mysteries, or 5 pieces of the same picture that we don't yet fully understand? And if all of this is just random chance, why has randomness been so consistent across the planet for millions of years? Do you think these footprints are just a coincidence? Or are they telling a story about a part of history we don't fully understand? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you love historical mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more discoveries.